Welcome to tonight's Conservation Café. I'm Eliza Cava, the Director of Conservation at Audubon Naturalist Society, and we've been running this series for 4 years now, since the beginning of 2017. And it's been just an amazing way to get to know people who are doing conservation, and we define that really broadly for the purpose of this series, and because in general, it takes everybody, it takes all kinds of ways and ideas to be an environmentalist, be a conservationist, not be an environmentalist or a conservationist in the way you see yourself, but still be having an impact on protecting our natural resources, protecting people's health, protecting our wildlife, our lands, our waters, our air, whatever it may be. You know, there's so many different ways that you can do that. So I'm going to give you a sneak preview at the end of what our next 3 upcoming cafes are, which have not been announced yet, but they're going to be very exciting. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Audubon Naturalist Society. If anybody's here for the first time with Audubon Naturalist Society, please use the chat to say that. We are a local independent environmental organization in the DC region. We inspire residents of the greater Washington, DC region to appreciate, understand, and protect their natural environment through outdoor experiences, education, and advocacy. And we seek to create a larger and more diverse community of people who treasure the natural world and work to preserve it. And for what it's worth, we have no affiliation with National Audubon Society. We are an independent organization. Check us out on social media. You can tweet or post tonight using the hashtag Conservation Cafe and let people know what you're hearing, what you're learning. And you can tag me and Lisa too if you like. She has a much bigger following than I do. So let me tell you a little bit more about Lisa. So Lisa Friedman is an environment and climate reporter for the New York Times. And prior to that, she was with E&E News, which is a trade publication that I used to read in my prior job with at Defenders of Wildlife. Where I sometimes read her work and used it very critically for my work. You may not know her unless you yourself are also an environmental professional, because from that perspective, because E&E News is subscription only. But let me tell you, that is where environmental policy gets done and reported upon. And so I know that some people who are here tonight know your work from your E&E days or met you at a COP where you were reporting there. They let me know. So, but for the last several years, she's been with the New York Times, where she's been breaking these incredible stories. We've been really lucky to have her at the New York Times all throughout the Trump administration, where there's been so much important environmental news. I will say that the reason I can get New York Times speakers is because I asked my wife to ask them personally. She works at the New York Times. So thank you, Rachel. Big shout out for asking Lisa, but also it's been wonderful to get to know Lisa over the last few years and celebrate Rosh Hashanah together and visit your pizza restaurant. So if you want to make a plug for the restaurant at any point, please do. So
my husband does all the work. I bring home the health insurance in the family.
It's a good match there. An entrepreneur and someone with health insurance. So with that, I'm going to invite Lisa to introduce herself any additional way that she would like to, and then we'll start asking questions. And my first question, which I'll just let her launch into, is just to tell us about how do you take a really complicated, meaty, nerdy, wonky story and make it so that people can understand it on the local level. You write about policies, you write about laws, you write about regulations, and that exists at a level that many of us just either don't read about or just is so struggle to understand. So how do you tell those stories? But also feel free to introduce yourself further. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. I'm so glad to do this, and really flattered that you wanted me to be part of your cafe tonight. I think these sessions sound terrific, and thank you, all of you, for having me. I think I'll answer your question by telling you a little bit about my background, because I am sort of an accidental Washington reporter. And even an accidental climate change reporter. I started working for newspapers when I was 16 years old. I got a job at I grew up in a 3 newspaper, a day family, and got a job at a local newspaper, the North Jersey Herald News in New Jersey, answering phones and writing obituaries and following reporters to plane crashes and city council meetings and murder scenes, and stayed with, and like it sort of immediately found my home right at newspapers. And I worked for local papers most of my career. I was a police reporter at at the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I went to Bakersfield, California, where I started a prison beat. I wrote about, there's a lot of crime in Bakersfield. I did a lot of crime stories. I came out to Washington to be the Washington, well, they called me bureau chief, but there was no one else in the bureau. So it was really, I was just chief of me for the Oakland Tribune. Sometimes I'd bring my dog to work on Sundays, and then I was chief of him. I was the Washington bureau chief for the Oakland Tribune and the LA Daily News. And then, I was sort of climbing the rung of newspapers when the ladder started to fall out below me in 2008. And I landed quite by accident at E&E at Climate Wire, which was hiring. And, and so and from there, covered climate change, covered mostly the international negotiations, but also what climate change means for some of the poorest communities in some of the poorest countries in the world. I think when I took a job at Climate Wire, part of my brain was saying, wow, how long could I write about one single topic, climate change? And really quickly learned that this was, not just a beat about absolutely everything, from food security to immigration to intellectual property law to, how we get our cereal. Also just the most interesting beat I've ever had. And so when you ask how you make complicated stuff, how you boil complicated stuff down, part of it is practice and years of being yelled at by editors saying, nobody's going to understand that word. Don't use stakeholder. Only use stakeholder if you're referring to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and you feel like you've used steak too many times. But, really, really working hard to seek out people and communities who are affected by policies in Washington and telling those stories, as part of what's happening in DC, because there's always a, there's the parlor game of what's happening at the White House, and there's regulatory fights and there's congressional fights, and all of that is interesting. But, to me, what is the most important story to tell and what we try to tell, even though we do, certainly get caught up in the Washington, news, but is to try to make those connections and show what these policies mean for communities across the country.
So I guess my first detailed question for you really is to tell one of those particular stories. And as an Audubon Society, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is really fundamental to our organization. A reason why we were independent of National Audubon Society is because we were founded before the chapters that then federated to become National Audubon Society at the beginning of the Audubon movement in 1897. And that the reason for the beginning of that movement was to pass a law to protect birds from hunting. And that's the law that ultimately became the Migratory Bird Treaty Act when it was passed. So all Audubon societies, all bird conservation societies of any sort, not that we are any longer only a bird conservation society, we actually do a lot of things, but we feel it in our bones, any threats to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And I know that it moved us a lot to get involved in some federal action alerts and things that we don't normally get involved in as a local organization when your reporting came out on the ways that the Trump administration was gutting the Migratory Bird Treaty Act through new regulations. So can you tell us, how did you break that story? Because I remember it was a big surprise. It wasn't like anything had been noticed and commented in the Federal Register yet, or if it had, I hadn't heard about it from my colleagues. I heard about it from you. So how do you break a story like that?
Sure. Yeah, that story really touched a lot of people. Even I was surprised by the intensity that story generated. Just for I'm sure everybody is up to speed, but the Trump administration starting pretty early in the administration, but it took a long time to finalize. First put out a Solicitor General opinion, and then established in regulation a change to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that sort of gave essentially liability protection to businesses, any entities that accidentally kill migratory birds, in the course of doing business, and that includes, birds that might be killed in oil spills. It also included birds that might be killed even in the act of doing something illegal, like spraying a banned pesticide, as long as the intention behind, for example, the spraying of a banned pesticide was not explicitly to kill birds. And so in that case, what we did is, we were able to get, really a trove of Freedom of Information Act request responses. And in this particular case, another NGO, Center for Biological Diversity, they had FOIA'd, they'd filed a public records request across the Fish and Wildlife Service for emails, at the various regional offices about the changes to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I file FOIAs every day, and a lot of my stories are from FOIAs that, came back to me, but I also don't think of everything, and a lot of a lot of groups, like yours and others, have their own attorneys that file FOIA requests on behalf of issues that they care very deeply about and work closely on. And in this case, they got back a number of emails and shared them with me. And I started going through them, and what they showed, in state after state, was just a real concern among agency officials at every level about the loss of protections, and a really visceral picture of how these protections for birds were unraveling. I don't know if there's something particular from the story that you wanted to.
Well, I thought one of the really interesting aspects of it was the Gull Island in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's local to our region. And
Right.
for those who don't know the story, and Lisa starts speaking after I finish asking my question, I might pull it up to show stories about this. It's a little island off of Hampton Roads. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's right. Yeah.
Where there's a bridge that goes across a big sound, and this particular population of gulls has been coming back to this island. The island itself is a spoil island originally from dredging, but it's become naturalized, and it's got all these terns on it. The biggest tern colony in Virginia, I think, was the story, possibly in the whole bay. And under this new interpretation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, they needed to do a highway expansion of the bridge, a big change of the bridge. And under this new interpretation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Trump administration Fish and Wildlife Service was ready to tell the state of Virginia, you don't really need to do anything about destroying that island, because you're not trying to kill the birds, you're trying to expand your highway. And so it would be incidental, and it's not a big deal, and you're not trying to hunt them or anything, but it would be an enormous loss to this nesting population. So that was one of the first biggest examples that really got national attention. And you took that story and nationalized it. You showed the connection between what was happening there, which had already been reported in the local news, if I remember correctly,
Absolutely.
and made it part of this national reporting that showed what was happening with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more about, like, well, maybe this is a question about the New York Times. How does the New York Times, relate to local stories that you find that others have reported and elevate them to the national level? What's that like, to be working at a national paper with the reach of the New York Times, and you pull stories out from local papers?
I mean, it's, I've been on both sides of this, right? I mean, I've been the local reporter who, has been writing, week after week about a really important local story, and then a big paper sort of sweeps in and, uses it as, a lead anecdote in a broader story. And, suddenly everybody is paying attention. And, as a local reporter, you're kind of like, I've been I've been writing about this for years. So, I can only imagine that it must be, very frustrating to local reporters. And I do sympathize with that. As, at the times, I mean, sometimes something like this might be a story in itself. In this case, and sometimes I see small things that, I see things in local papers that, might make an interesting story, and I tuck it away for, maybe we could do something on this and take a larger look. In this case, we had fresh documents that, that nobody had from these Freedom of Information Act requests that helped tell this even bigger story about how, while the Trump administration was telling the public that businesses and governments and other entities are going to act voluntarily. They don't need, a threat of prosecution and fines to do the right thing by the birds. They're going to act voluntarily to do the right thing. We were seeing in black and white that, that wasn't happening, that the government was telling, in this case, the state, that they were off the hook for expensive protections, to protect birds in that area, and the state was prepared to pack it in until it became public in a big way.
Right.
So that, I mean, it was gratifying. It was, truly to see that had that kind of an impact.
And that's what happened. So for our listeners who may not know the story, I think I looked it up. The island is called South Island, and initially voluntarily, but now it will be under the new regulations that will have to be put back in place under
Right.
the Biden administration. Virginia actually went through this wild operation of, they still needed to impact the island, but they hauled out barges and let the gulls nest on the barges until they could reestablish a new, basically spoil island, I think, and the terns could come back and nest on that next year. So they created a temporary island for the terns to return to in the spring of 2020, and they did it. It worked.
Which was the original intent in the first place. It was, I don't want to speak out of turn. I might be misremembering, but if I remember correctly, there were studies done on options, and that was the one they were honing in on before the Trump administration, advised them that anything they did would be purely voluntary.
Yeah. So with the press, we get good voluntary things, is my read on the situation. So let me ask my next another question. And audience attendees, at any point, if you want to ask questions, pop them in that Q&A box or raise your hand. We can, I have more questions, but we can move to yours and intersperse them at any time. So please do chime in. The next thing I'd like you to talk to us about is, so when I reached out to you to remind you that we needed to talk about this, it happened to be on Climate Day, which was 2 Wednesdays ago, when President Biden sat down and signed a ton of executive orders on climate change. And so you didn't reply to me, which is fair. But what does that mean? So what does that flurry of executive orders and other actions that the administration can take on its own mean for the climate? And I ask this in kind of a deep way. Like, I'm scared about climate crisis. I, as you know, have 2 little kids, and we've lost so much time, and so many bad things are already happening both around the world and here. So I want to know that a new administration can actually make meaningful change. And so what they did sounded really great. I was so excited. I was watching the news. I've read up on some of those executive orders, but what will they do? And do you think it will truly be meaningful? And I know this is something you have really deep knowledge on. So maybe you can start with sort of yes or no and why, and then what else needs to be done.
Sure. Maybe let me just back up for those of you. I mean, again, forgive me if I'm
Please.
telling folks stuff, and I'll just, but I'll just sort of review that, when, the Trump administration, as I think, most people here know, rolled back more than 100 environmental regulations, and virtually all of the Obama era regulations addressing climate change. We saw 4 years where the Trump administration pretty consistently mocked climate science, and put in place various, from the president on down, played with, creating teams at the White House to publicly debate, the science of climate change, and and looked for ways to undermine the National Climate Assessment, which was the big, major, every 4-year congressionally mandated report from 13 federal agencies, on the state of what is known about climate change and how it affects the United States. So that's by way of background. President Biden campaigned heavily on tackling climate change, and he promised a lot of things, including getting the United States to net zero emissions by 2050, eliminating fossil fuel emissions from the power sector by 2035, building 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, ramping up, energy efficient building of homes. And what we saw in the Biden campaign, and what we saw then reflected almost immediately in his administration, was like if you think about, there was a lot of focus in the campaign about fracking, and if folks want to talk about that, we can, and what he's going to do on oil and gas leasing, et cetera. But if you think about tackling climate change as a sort of series of carrots and sticks, you have regulation on one hand, and incentives on another to to develop energy efficiency or renewable energy. Biden, particularly in this moment of pandemic and economic recovery, has really been focusing on the carrots and trying to link his climate agenda as much as possible to a job creation agenda. Mm-hmm. And so that brings us to the 27th, which was Climate Day in the administration, when, as you noted, Biden issued a number of executive actions on climate change. And what he said from the Oval Office is it's Climate Day, which means it's Jobs Day, right? And so the real answer to your question of like, okay, what do these things do? What did he do, and what impact does that have? On one level, an executive action does nothing, right? It's a piece of paper that the president signs to set a tone and to tell agencies to do things. Nothing in these executive actions immediately starts to reduce the United States share of emissions.
They can also be repealed immediately on the first day by the next administration.
On the other hand, I mean, as Biden did with Trump's executive orders, right? When Trump signed an executive order on, energy independence, that in itself didn't do anything, but it set in motion rollbacks throughout the various agencies and new policies, in that case, aimed at promoting fossil fuel development. And in turn, this sets in motion efforts at every agency to address climate change. And there's dozens of imperatives in these executive actions. One of the things it did was to create a national task force made up of members of 21 agencies, and they met for the first time today to talk about, okay, how does the housing department work on climate change and help meet whatever the new goals, the emissions goals of the US are going to be? How does the Treasury Department, use its leverage with financial regulations? What can the Department of Transportation do? So those are some of the big things that are happening. And at every agency, they have been charged with coming up with plans for what that agency can do, both internally in terms of procurement and externally in terms of rules and regulations and policies to address climate change in their space.
So we're going to see a build. We're going to see that these executive actions will lead to the real concrete changes throughout every agency.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think part of the goal, that this administration says it has is sort of baking in attention to climate change at every part of the government. And, in tandem, looking for specific ways to create jobs as it builds a clean energy economy. So, you're going to see things in the coming weeks outside of these executive orders, like a lot of green stimulus that may be part of a new COVID relief proposal.
Right.
For now, the administration is doing what it can do without Congress, which include, for example, there is money that has already been authorized by Congress through ARPA-E, a program at the Department of Energy, and they are issuing solicitations to deal with grants for big clean technology problems. How do we improve energy storage? They're planning to do that with low emission vehicles through the Department of Transportation. So they're looking for ways to get money out to start building things and creating jobs.
So I guess you've highlighted my next question, which is Congress. So they're going to operate without Congress for some time. And I'd like you to look into your crystal ball and tell us whether you think Congress will pass a climate bill. But you said something very interesting about the stimulus package, and I have heard this before. We do expect we'll get another stimulus package. So how much climate stuff is going to be in that? Stimulus packages have a lot of job stuff. If jobs and climate are the same thing in a Biden administration, is that kind of what we should expect climate legislation to look like, or will there be something else that might move? And we have had, by the way, some great audience questions. I don't know if that's what you're peering at. And so Amy and Ariel, I will bring your questions next, but also if anybody would like to, and I see we also have a hand up. So this will be my last sort of substantive question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Okay.
Which is crystal ball on
Sure.
Congress.
I mean, I don't really need I need a crystal ball for Congress, but I don't have, but Biden has said that he, that climate change will be a major part of, a forthcoming COVID relief and infrastructure package. So, I think,
what does that mean? Like, what could we expect that's solid, that will be in the package that is climate change funding?
I mean, I think, certainly you could see things like tax extenders for renewable energy. Okay. Are you going to see a carbon tax pass Congress? I don't think so. No, I don't think I need a particularly good crystal ball to see that. I don't think even if the Democratic majority wasn't as thin as it is, I think there's still, there has grown a lot of opposition to a carbon tax on the left, as well as the right. But I think you are going to see, a number of efforts of Republicans trying to work with Democrats on where they can. I think that, you'll see cooperation on things like CCS. I've heard mixed things about, the most, one of the most specific goals that Biden has is in the power sector to reduce fossil fuel emissions 26 to, I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up with the Paris Agreement target, pardon me, to eliminate fossil fuel emissions from the power sector by 2035. There are a couple ways to do that. One of which is to go back to the EPA and try to revive some version of the Clean Power Plan, which has been battered around by the courts back and forth. And the EPA, likely incoming administrator Michael Reagan, was a little evasive, but seemed during his confirmation hearing, but seemed to indicate that there wasn't a huge amount of appetite to revive that regulatorily. Another option is a clean energy standard. It's not clear whether that could pass Congress. There are some people who think that if it was designed with nuclear and CCS for gas, that could bring
carbon capture and storage.
Pardon me. Sorry. Yes, yeah. Carbon capture and storage for gas, that could bring Republicans on board. That also would face some serious opposition from progressives. So, it's really, to me, unclear whether something big can move through Congress and get past a certain senator from West Virginia.
Oh, yes, Mr. Manchin. So we have some great questions from the audience, and I want to surface those. Georgiana raised her hand to ask live, but then she put her hand back down. Georgiana, I love your question. It dovetails right on what we just were talking about. So if you'd like to ask it live, please raise your hand. In the meantime, while you decide, I'm going to throw a different question out for Lisa, which is one that honestly, Ariel has attended a lot of these talks, and this is just my personal question as well as Ariel's, which is, so, you're really focused on what can happen. You're really focused on the practical, the tea leaves, the Joe Manchin's there. So, and yet we need to combat climate change. So can we do it? So what Ariel asks is, what is giving you pause about our ability as a nation to combat climate change? And where are you finding hope in this fight for our planet? And I guess this is your story, but it's also reality. So given what you know about it, are you worried? Are you hopeful? Why?
So I always pause during questions like this because, like many reporters, I'm very cynical, and there are definitely days when I think like, oh God, we're not going to do anything until the food runs out. But I don't want that to be my takeaway, because I do, I think what I find, I think that, you can't count on Congress to do things at the pace that's needed. And, I think what has been really hopeful, even through the Trump administration, is that in states and communities all over the country have been, and businesses, have been taking really impressive steps to reduce emissions, even when the federal government wasn't acting, and are continuing to do that. So I think that to me is one area that was really hopeful. I think another, I know that the shift is not quick enough for many people, but I do see a metamorphosis in the Republican Party on climate change. And I feel like it's coming from a few areas. One is the growth of renewable energy. And there are a lot of members of Congress who, Oklahoma will always be an oil and gas state, but it's also the fastest growing wind, state in the country. And, maybe that is not shifting the opinion of Jim Inhofe, the senator who famously threw a snowball on the Senate floor to prove that global warming in February, to prove that global warming doesn't exist. But, it is, I think it is making other lawmakers in the state more, warmer to renewable energy, not out of any, thought about climate change, maybe, which they feel is too,
Weird.
well, we don't need to get into, but because it produces jobs in their state. And, and I see the movement among young Republicans who are telling older generations of Republicans that they want to tackle this issue. And if the Republican Party wants their vote, maybe they don't agree with the way that that Democrats want to address climate change. They don't believe that regulation, for example, is the way to go. But they do want to see their party do more than just say, then finally just say the words climate change, or, speak to some vague technology development. They want to see real things from the party. And I feel like that, I feel like I'm seeing changes in that space. And, at the end of the day, I've covered Congress now since the late 90s. Anything really lasting has been bipartisan. And so there are things that, maybe Democrats can push through, but if there's going to be big legislation, there's gonna, I mean, what can I say? It's difficult because you're running up against a planetary deadline that doesn't, isn't going to wait for one party to get in line. But, so yes, tension, but I do see some hope in that space.
Thank you. That's a hard one. Like screaming hard sometimes for me, but I'm not cynical yet. So this is one that comes back to this.
Oh gosh, I see somebody asking me to slow down. I'm sorry, I talk so fast.
I think it was me. I think it was me. We're both talking fast, but I think it was me.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. We all apologize for talking so fast. But thank you for catching us. All right, so the next question I'm going to give you is from the chat box, because I did see that Georgiana had been wanting to ask it live, but she put her hand down, so I'm just going to read it to you. She says, thanks for being here, Lisa. What about Biden's initiatives making their way to the states and localities, giving the funding stresses mostly because of COVID? People have lost jobs, losing their homes, etc. And I'll make that concrete. I work at the local level, and revenues in some cases are actually not down as much as they seemed like they would be, but they're in huge flux. It's very hard to predict. So it's very hard to lock in new policies, lock in the funding that we're going to need to deal with climate adaptation, for example, when local budgets are going to be so stretched and have so much recovery work to do for the next few years. Yeah. So what do you see there as opportunities or potential next steps that might happen?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know that I have a ton of insight there, other than to say I know that is something the administration is looking at. I mean, I know that under the Trump administration worked against many states that were trying to do resilience work and mitigation work locally. And the Biden administration is actively looking for ways to support states, in no small part because the United States in a couple months is going to have to submit new targets as part, or announce new targets to the international community as part of the Paris Agreement. What emissions goal the US will set for 2030. And, members of the administration have said that they would like to find a way to reflect the work that states and local governments are doing to reduce emissions. And so I know that they are actively looking for ways to help that happen. I don't have enough visibility, this early in the administration into what exactly they're doing.
Okay. I guess we'll wait and see. And that's the sort of thing that my organization will be looking at, very, very carefully. How does this all work? So I don't know if you're looking at the Q&A box. There's now a lot of questions. So if you see one you want to be sure to answer, then grab it. Otherwise, I might ask you a question that I think is from my friend Mary Bass at Potomac Conservancy, who asks in the chat box, given your experience as a local reporter, what is effective to get media attention to issues? And I assume she means environmental issues, but maybe she does not. She just said issues. So Mary, if you want to clarify, please feel free. But what tips would you give us if we want to get your attention or get the attention of your local colleagues on an amazing climate adaptation strategy that our local governments are trying to get funded and failing, for example?
I mean, it's not hard. I mean, reporters are looking for good stories in this space. I mean, I think the elements of a story in the environmental space are the elements of a story anywhere. What's happening that's surprising or new or hasn't been told before, or a trend that hasn't been written well about. Those are all things that we look at. I don't have enough to say about this particular story yet, but I am been talking to some folks about historic African-American cemeteries, many of which are threatened by climate change. And, one of the things I'm, and it's new to me, but it's not a new story. I see, I thought it was incredibly interesting. And then I did some Google searches and I saw, okay, this has been written about here and there. And so, what I'm asking folks as I'm talking to them is, what's new? What's, is there, funding initiatives that are happening that are new? Is there, a level of, threat that has reached a new level? I mean, that's sort of, I guess that's the most recent story where I could give a concrete example of, because just the fact that we haven't written about it before isn't really enough to make it a story for us. It has to be, okay, so what's happening? What's happening now? What's new with this?
Which can be hard sometimes when the story is like, oh, gosh, we keep cutting trees down.
Right. We're threatened.
Yeah, this animal that wasn't doing very well 10 years ago is in fact doing a little bit worse now. But I hear you. This is my only tip about local media attention that ever worked for me. We once pitched a story in December, and a local Post reporter who sort of did general interest stories picked it up right before Christmas. And it was pretty clearly a great slow news time, and she came and did a wonderful story. Yeah. So that's the only time I felt really successful in my media pitching strategies.
Yeah.
So many great questions here.
Question about and I'll take this one. Regarding the Biden administration's new executive orders and policy direction, all of government engaged on climate, a lot depends on the bureaucracy of those departments. I know many fervent environmentalists were purged during the Trump years, replaced with pro-energy, climate deniers, et cetera. Do you have a feeling for how the bureaucracy and all the departments is prepared to really make the necessary changes? I think that's a great question. I think, one of the huge challenges the Biden administration faces, even as it has these plans to do big stuff, is to rebuild the guts of the agencies. Bureau of Land Management, all of the people who left when they moved the agency headquarters out west. EPA suffered a terrible brain drain. I think that
it's not a conspiracy theory to say that was basically by design, right?
I don't know, not at all.
I mean, that of the Bureau of Land Management, for example.
Yeah, that was. I don't think it is much of a conspiracy theory at all. No. So particularly in the beginning, the Trump administration spoke very openly about wanting to dramatically reduce the ranks of agencies that they felt did too much to hamstring industry. And they succeeded in large part. Does that mean, that regulations won't get done, or they, won't have, I mean, I think, no, I think there still will be a robust regulatory, job being done in the, but there are fewer people in positions. It's going to be a process, right? I mean, I think the Trump administration, I wish I came with numbers. I don't know. They tried often to, every year to slash the budget. Congress was, didn't let it happen to the extent that the Trump administration wanted. But, we're going to see efforts to build up the budget in these agencies again. That will be its own legislative fight. And so it's going to be a sort of slow and arduous process. And it's not at all clear what level either of personnel, or capability the administration will be able to get some of these agencies back to.
Yeah. I do know, just from being an environmentalist living in the Washington area, that there are people who have just hunkered down and are now really ready to get back to, focusing. So that's the flip side of the loss, right? Is that there are some people who have stayed put and have a huge knowledge base to draw upon to be helpful. But
absolutely. And I mean, you asked in the beginning how we get stories. I mean, I will say now that, one of the, I think everyone knows that career employees over the past 4 years, particularly in environmental agencies, were all scared for their jobs. They were laying low. They were trying not to use the words climate change, so they wouldn't get transferred into accounting. But a lot of really, sort of heroic, I would say, things were being done inside the agencies, both to keep policies alive and to keep the public informed. There are many stories, from the Pruitt era on down, where we knew that employees had put things in writing in emails so that they could be FOIA'd. So things like that, were just a tremendous help to reporters over the years. And, we were able to tell some stories, again, this is particularly going back to the Pruitt era, without getting putting anyone's job in jeopardy, because we were able to get public documents. But those documents were gettable because people, know how the system works and put things in writing, knowing that it could be released under public records laws.
Wow. So that must be a lot of the stories that you were able to tell.
It's a mix.
Right?
It's a mix of speaking to people and documents, and speaking to people about the documents.
Speaking to people who tell you what to put in the FOIA request, or that you found the.
Yeah, very much that.
Must have been. So is there any other question you want to take on next, or should I pick the next one?
Oh, you could pick. You pick that. I can't read and think at the same time.
Okay. I'm going to ask you then a personal question, another personal question. Cyril asks, what is the hardest or most interesting story you ever worked on?
Oh. Well, I mean, I think that would precede the times, when I was at Climate Wire, I really wanted, I wrote a lot about the issue of climate migration, and I really wanted to untangle all of the factors there. And this was 2008, when the issue of climate migration was really focused on small islands, right? Sea levels rise, island sinks, you know, and what I wanted to do and wound up doing was going to Bangladesh to try to tell this much more complicated story of what it means when you have climate change as a threat multiplier, as they say, acting, in a country that has, terrible infrastructure and not great civil infrastructure, and extreme poverty, and is also dealing with all of these other, massive urbanization, and border tensions with India. And so that was, I spent about 3 weeks in Bangladesh, and which was really the highlight of my career. People were just incredibly generous with their stories and their time, but trying to, just from a writing level, trying to sort of fit those pieces together and tell those stories in ways that that sort of broke down how complicated this issue was I think one of the more challenging and gratifying stories I've done in this space.
What's an anecdote that stands out from that experience, that like an image or a particular story or element of it that you really remember?
Oh, well, I mean, the thing I remember most is not about the story, but it was when I arrived in Dhaka, I needed a cell phone, I needed a SIM card, remember those? And the person at the hotel said, there's a shopping mall over there. Why did I call you a car? And I said, a car, but it's right over there. I'll just walk. And suddenly I was in the middle of 18 million people, and and I think I'd been too overly careful about the modesty issue and being in a Muslim country, and it was so hot, and I had like a turtleneck and and a head covering, and it was hot as hell, and it was terrifying to cross the street, and I turned around and I called my husband. It was 4 a.m, and I was like, I can't even cross the street. What am I gonna do? And my husband was like very kind and said, you're fine, but also like your company spent a lot of money to send you to Bangladesh.
Figure it out.
Figure it out. So I accepted the car and got the cell phone, and then trained myself to cross the street, mostly by like gesturing to women who seemed nice, like, can I walk with you? But so, and I feel like I should have a T-shirt that says like, I crossed Gulshan Circle and survived. But I just spent a lot of time in the Satkhira district of Bangladesh, and really what the real answer of what stands out is I spent a lot of time with people who have rebuilt their homes time and time again, from devastating flooding that's only getting worse, and get virtually no help from the government, and are the deepest victims of a problem that was not their creation. And so the real answer to your question is really seeing how how the poorest people in the world are suffering the most from a problem that they did not create and from which they are not really benefiting. The industrial revolution is not, they're not reaping the same benefits that others have from that.
Yeah, that's intense. It brings me to one of the first questions that was asked in our Q&A box by Amy, about plastic pollution, because when I think of powerful environmental stories that have been told about South Asian countries that are struggling with sea level rise and things like that, another thing I think of is oceans of plastic pollution, which I imagine you saw on your trip to Dhaka. I visited well, some cities in the world where I've seen a lot of plastic pollution, but I've heard or seen pictures more about countries with bad infrastructure in particular, where you have to buy every piece of water. You get your food packaged in a lot of plastic because otherwise it feels unsafe to, to carry it around through a really filthy city or something like that. So Amy Marin asks this question about plastic pollution. Says the production of plastic from fossil fuels is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. And you can see the full question in the question box, but during his hearing for EPA Director nominee Michael Regan, Senator Merkley of Oregon asked Michael Regan to look more closely at the Presidential Plastics Action Plan, which I'm not familiar with. I don't know if you are. It's a document backed by more than 500 community and environmental advocacy groups that asks the Biden administration to enact policies to reduce plastic pollution, such as creating an office for recycling, market development, and waste reduction, and appoint a plastic pollution czar. And I read a powerful story recently about how the fossil fuel industry is just ready to ship plastics off to the rest of the world. Like that's their next plan. As developed countries are ready to move to EVs, the fossil fuel industry is like, great, we'll just sell more plastic to countries that are not going to make car regulations anytime soon, but still don't buy very many cars. So what are your thoughts for prospects about the action on that front? Because not only is it a horrible, horrible oceans, wildlife, health concern, it's also emissions.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I have not written as much in this area as I wish I have. My colleague, Kuroka Tabuchi, I encourage you to look her up. She has written some great stuff. And I'd also give a shout out to Emily Holden at The Guardian, who, to my mind, has done some of the best reporting on plastic pollution, and sort of the cynical support that industry has had of recycling. I mean, I think all I could say is the likelihood of the federal government backing some of these policies is a lot greater than it was 2 months ago. I haven't heard anything specific, but I also haven't been focused as much on this, so I don't want to speak about stuff I don't know so well.
Okay, that's fair. I wonder personally, like, is it going to be a major contributor to emissions that we're not yet really taking account of?
Yeah.
Okay, there's still many wonderful questions, but I'm going to ask you one of mine, which I did not preview for you. And I'm asking you this because I know you do know a lot about natural gas and fracking. This isn't really about natural gas and fracking, it's about leaks. So there was an explosion in a pipe in Adams Morgan, I think the other day. It was on Prince of Petworth, for those of us local in Washington, D.C. It's frequent. There's a lot of methane leaks in the aging infrastructure of many of our cities. Before delivery, before it gets to the house. Sometimes there are leaks inside the houses, and like every year we hear just in the local news in DC or Baltimore, a house explodes because of a gas problem. It's dangerous stuff, and it's also, the pipes are more than 100 years old in some cases. I wonder if we even know how much is leaking. So is that something you've reviewed and you'd want to talk about the potential of that contribution to either greenhouse gas emissions in general, or like what might happen? What could we do about that?
My area of expertise is more federal policy. And so the part of the methane question that I know best is federal regulations. The Trump administration rolled back efforts at both the Interior and EPA to crack down on methane leaks at big oil and gas operations, huge contributors to climate change. And the Biden administration has said they will reinstate and strengthen those regulations. Interestingly, you have a lot of big oil majors who told the Trump administration, we are not in favor of rolling back these regulations, and who have signaled to the Biden administration that they are fine with this, and they see this as they see this as a corporate, sort of proving to the public that they are that they care about this issue and that they want to take care of methane leaks. So I think that we're going to see action on that in very short order. I would expect that to be one of the very early regulations that the Biden administration tackles, along with auto emissions.
Great, great, that's exciting. And it's an interest. I think it's a question, obviously not a federal one, that interests me, and which is, yeah, these cities with gas pipes. I don't know that it's well measured. I mean, how much is leaking out from under our ground? If we routinely have explosions, then there must be plenty. And we do.
Good question.
We do. I wonder how big the magnitude of that is. So I don't know if you need a break or a drink of water. We do have more questions, but I realize we've been talking a lot.
It's okay. But I'll let you know that when my connection fritzed out, I lost all of the Q&A thing.
Okay.
So I'll just leave it to you to pick whatever.
Okay.
Out to you.
Let's do another reportering question. So Chris asked, does the fact that a significant percentage of the country no longer believes in facts ever affect your enthusiasm for doing your job?
No, it really doesn't. I mean, I think, I get some interesting hate mail. But, for the most part, no, I would say it doesn't. I don't, I am a reporter, so I am interested in why people don't accept the science, or my job is a little different than, as an activist. I mean, while I hope through my stories and our presentation of science as part of policy issues that we are able to expose facts for people and maybe sway people who don't believe in climate change. I also think that it is part of my job to understand people who think it's a hoax or believe that, believe that this is God's will, or whatever the things that, I mean, this is part of the fabric of why it is a challenge to affect policy on climate change, and to just ignore it or dismiss it, I think would be like an abdication of my job as a reporter, rather than try to understand it. Folks can disagree. I know there's a lot of debate right now, not wanting to amplify, in this space, the voices of skeptics, right, or climate deniers, and I understand that, and we deal with this challenge all of the time, and particularly through the Trump years. I mean, there were people who we and most publications rarely, if ever, quoted because they were extremists, and then suddenly the extremists were the establishment, and you could not write about what they were saying and doing because it was the government. And so we constantly, every day, wrestled with, how do we get across what is happening, what the Trump administration is doing and saying, without amplifying factual inaccuracies or letting them go unanswered. And I think that is just critical to do. But on a personal level, I'm also still really interested in personally, and in reading stories and in doing stories about why this remains so difficult for people to accept? Why the science remains so difficult for people to accept?
Why do you think that is? I mean, not the extremists who ended up in the government, but the ordinary people who still find it so difficult to accept. What do you think?
I mean, I think it's a mix of, I mean, people who've studied and written about this, much better than I have, and and academics who are steeped in this, um, often say it comes down to a tribalism in a way, right? That the people that I identify with think that this is a hoax, and so so all of the information, I'm in that information bubble of those who believe that climate change is maybe not a hoax or overblown, and I think that it is. I'm kind of, it's hard for me to clearly understand why, but I think a lot of it is, it's true that it does, kind of come down to the team that people feel that they are on is a big part of it. I don't know. I mean, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I mean, I've talked to Republican, friend of mine who, we talk about sometimes how this issue in some ways is like has a parallel with illegal immigration, right? And hear me out. I mean, and I'm welcome.
In addition to the fact that climate change is a major driver of immigration.
Okay, but set that aside for a moment.
Okay.
But in that, I think to wildly generalize, right? I mean, I think a lot of, Democrats, liberals would say that, sure, illegal immigration is a problem, but there's a fundamental mistrust about the numbers that are put out by the right about the levels of illegal immigration, and a fundamental skepticism about the dire consequences that the right puts out about the consequences of illegal immigration. And that, I think, if you take away the crazy skeptics who say, the Dana Rohrbachers of the world who say, climate change is caused by dinosaur farts, I think you have a lot of conservatives who similarly feel the same way about climate change, that they accept that climate change is happening, and even that it's human caused, but they have a fundamental mistrust about the numbers, the urgency that they hear, Al Gore, Leonardo DiCaprio talking about, whether that is tribalism or something deeper. I think, I don't know. I'm not the right person to. I went on a wild tangent. Sorry.
No, I don't. I guess a tangent is one of the few things to do. I had someone apply for a job who was wanted to be an advocate in our organization, and he was not only a Republican in politics, but had worked for I forget if the Republican Congressional Committee or like he had worked in Republican politics for a part of his career, and he was young. He didn't have a long career, but he'd also done college Republicans and stuff like that. And he wanted to work on climate change. He wanted to work in an environmental advocacy organization on climate change, and he wasn't a fit for other reasons, but we considered him very seriously. We interviewed him, and we all wanted to ask him, like, what's it like wanting to work on climate change in the Republican spheres in which you've been? He's like, it was really hard. He said, we young people are trying to get the old people to the elected officials and so on who've been in office for a long time to do things, and they're not doing it. And he was kind of stuck. He didn't really know what to do. So he was coming to look at organizations like ours for which he didn't really have the right experience. But in the organizations for which he did have the right experience, he couldn't work on the issue that he was most passionate about.
Right.
And that was really rough.
Well, and I would say that, I mean, having talked to, the world of Republicans who work on climate change is small. I know a lot of them. And, but one of the things, when we talk about this sort of fundamental mistrust of the other side, what I hear a lot from conservatives who want to be engaged in climate change are, we can't do anything right. Every time we take a position, it's not enough, or we get, we get attacked from the left for being disingenuous or not doing, not going far enough. And B, that, they feel like they're being pushed to not just accept the science, but to accept something that they fundamentally object to, which is heavy, regulations, right? And so, this is not, I'm not a politician, but what I think is interesting as a reporter is seeing where, if at all, there is space to really find common ground here, because there are, I believe, a growing number of Republicans looking for a way to engage on climate change. And there's a lot of mistrust on both sides.
So that what brings us to what I think will be the last question, which is really tries to get at this from Bill. He says, so why do you feel it's so unlikely for us to get a price on carbon? You referenced a climate tax and that you thought it was not possible, but does the concept of a fee and dividend, such as HR 763, stand a better chance? It uses market mechanisms that Republicans like and offers opportunity to shift benefits to lower income populations in ways that Democrats like, and even many oil companies state support for this in concept. So is a bill like that not possible? Could bridge a divide and use the kind of mechanisms that both parties like?
Yeah, I mean, look, what do I know, right? I mean, I was one of the reporters who in 2018, when Democrats, won the House, was writing, oh, they're not really gonna, focus too much on climate change. And then, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, lit a fire under everybody with the Green New Deal and completely changed the landscape of how climate change is being thought about and dealt with on Capitol Hill. So I shouldn't even try to have a crystal ball. A carbon tax is going to be hard for the following reasons, and I don't know that it's not possible, but here are the some of the world of challenges. On the right, you have Grover Norquist, who has had Republicans sign pledges of no new taxes, who would fight it tooth and nail. And on the left, you have a growing concern about a carbon tax as the best way to address climate change, because it's seen as a regressive tax. And would a, cap and dividend, solution, be a solution to that? Yes, if you could get it to pass. I think I once quoted John Podesta, who told me, you can get 300 Republicans pardon me, I'm going to butcher the quote. You can get 300 economists to be in favor of a carbon tax, but I'm not sure you can get 300 members of Congress. It has challenges. And at this moment in I would say, additionally in a pandemic, as this administration is focused on reviving the economy, I do wonder if proposing a tax is going to be something that they see as a political winner. I think, they are much more focused on finding money to inject into the economy, rather than certainly something that could be branded by the right, as something that would hit people in their pocketbooks. So am I saying it can't pass? No. I mean, we've been hearing that Murkowski and Coons are going to introduce a carbon tax bill. There's, I'm just passing along rumor here. I don't know that for a fact. I don't know it well enough to report it in my paper, but I'm telling you. So maybe these are sort of trial balloons to see, what kind of response it gets from Congress. It would be exciting to see because at the end of the day, it is, the most efficient way to ratchet down emissions. But for now, it seems like the Biden administration is going, they haven't taken it off the table. And we heard Gina McCarthy said in E&E today that, that everything is on the table, but it feels like they are looking at other routes and not putting all their eggs in that basket.
Yeah. Well, I think with that, I'm going to stop asking questions and come to a wrap. So first of all, thank you, a huge thank you. This has been really fun for me. First of all, because I like talking with you, and second of all, because it's you say you don't know things well enough to report them in your paper, but you're telling us anyway. Let's just say you know a lot about a lot of these things, way, way, way more than I do. And that's what I love best about this series, is that I get to talk with such smart people. And so thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. And thank you for sharing with us in such a fun, real way. So I hope our audience has as much fun with this series and with tonight's talk as I do.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so nice.